Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we're diving into something that probably surprises you about ancient Greece, the obsession with fashion as a weapon. And I'm not talking about casual wardrobe choices. I'm talking about intentional, calculated sartorial rebellion. When you think of ancient Greece, you're imagining togas, or maybe chitons, simple white linen draped in classical perfection, classical restraint, timeless elegance. But the reality? A lot of Greek nobles were out here dressing like they were trying to make their mothers faint and their enemies reconsider their life choices. So like always, if you're into weird history and unexpected details about the people we thought we understood, smash that like button. Throw a subscribe in there. Let me know in the comments what shocked you most about ancient fashion. And genuinely, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time of day it is for you, because this stuff fascinates me. Now turn off some of those distractions. Maybe pour yourself something to drink. And let's talk about how the ancient Greeks weaponized their closets in ways that would make any modern influencer blush with envy. The thing about ancient Greek nobles is that we've built this image in our heads, right? Thanks to statues, textbooks, classical paintings, we imagine them draped in simple white cloth, understated, elegant, embodying this ideal of rational perfection. Socrates probably looked like that. Plato almost certainly dressed that way. Conservative, moderate, rooted in this philosophy of nothing in excess. This idea that the well-developed human being balanced all aspects of themselves, including their aesthetic choices. The Greek ideal, as we've been told for centuries, was restraint, simplicity, the harmony between body and mind expressed through clean lines and minimal adornment. That's the ideal that gets taught, the one that shapes our image of ancient Greece. Even when they did wear color, we imagine it was subtle, dignified. A hint of dye here and there to indicate status, but never so much as to look ridiculous. Never enough to seem vain. Never enough to appear as if you cared too much about the superficial. This is what high school taught us. This is what museum plaques reinforce. This is the image that stuck. We look at the classical sculptures, and we see that restraint, that minimalism, and we think that's how people actually were. We forget that those statues were painted. We forget that ancient accounts describe a much messier reality. But if you actually dig into what ancient Greek nobles were actually wearing, what they were actually doing with their bodies, their hair, their accessories, the picture gets messier, weirder, way more intentionally provocative. Because the truth is, plenty of Greek nobles understood fashion the way modern celebrities understand social media. It was a tool, a weapon, a way to make a statement that went far beyond just covering your body, a way to claim power, authority, freedom from normal restrictions. Some of them dressed to shock, some of them dressed to challenge, some of them dressed to say, I am not bound by your rules, your expectations, your sense of what's proper. I'm above that. I'm beyond that. And that was absolutely intentional. The evidence is scattered through ancient texts, through archaeological findings, through the complaints of people who watched these nobles walk through the agora, dressed in ways that made absolutely no sense to conservative society. We have letters complaining about it. We have laws trying to restrict it. We have accounts of people being scandalized by what they saw. Take the case of the dandies, the ornate dressers, the nobles who treated their appearance like an art form. These weren't fringe weirdos. These were powerful men, wealthy men, men with real political ambitions and real political power who were making deliberate choices about how they presented themselves to the world. And those choices weren't accident. They weren't the result of not knowing better. They weren't the result of just having money and not knowing what to do with it. They were calculated statements wrapped in fabric and dye. One of the most shocking things to understand about ancient Greek fashion is that it wasn't as uniform as we think. Within the ideal of the chiton, the simple draped tunic that we see on statues, there was room for enormous variation. The length could differ. You could wear it short, showing your thighs, marking yourself as someone who spent time in athletic pursuits. Or you could wear it long, down to the ankles, which marked you as either elderly or dangerously feminine depending on who you were. The way it was fastened changed. The pins used to hold it at the shoulder could be ornate or simple. Those pins could be bronze, could be silver, could be decorated with intricate designs that announced your wealth and taste. The belt could be plain or decorated with intricate patterns. You could cinch it tight at the waist or let it hang loose. You could pleat it, fold it, arrange it in ways that emphasized your body or concealed it. And that's before we even talk about the color. Because when we look at ancient Greek statues now, they're white, pure white marble. We've internalized this as the aesthetic of classical Greece, as if whiteness itself was the Greek ideal. But here's the thing that blows minds every single time. Those statues were painted, brightly painted, with colors that would look gaudy to modern eyes. The Greeks saw them in brilliant blues, reds, yellows, greens. They had pigments, they had access to dyes, and they used them freely. And on cloth, the possibilities multiplied exponentially. When a noble wore colored fabric, especially expensive colored fabric, it wasn't a whisper, it was a shout. It was you saying, "Look at me. I'm different, I'm special, I have money, I have taste, I'm not bound by your expectations." The dyes themselves were expensive. Extracting color from plants, insects, murex shells that took resources, skill, time. A wealthy man wearing elaborately dyed cloth was flexing. He was saying, "I have so much money that I can afford to wrap myself in luxury, in colors that took weeks to produce, that cost more than you make in a year." But beyond just the showing off of wealth, there's something more subtle happening. When you deliberately wore clothing that was different from what society expected, you were making a claim about your autonomy. You were saying, "I don't need to conform to what makes you comfortable. I don't need to dress the way everyone else dresses. I'm different, and I'm proud of it." And for men living in societies with strict codes about propriety, masculinity, and what constituted respectable behavior, that was genuinely shocking. Some nobles took it further. The sources mention men who wore their hair long and ornately braided, decorated with ribbon and gold. Men who dyed their hair. Men who wore more jewelry than their wives, more gold, more silver, more adornment than society said was appropriate for a man. Men who wore more jewelry than was respectable. Men who experimented with foreign fashions, adopting Persian styles or Egyptian innovations that had absolutely no place in the Greek tradition. To conservative Greeks, this looked insane. It looked like transgression. And the T was exactly the point. The obsession with purple is maybe the most vivid example of how fashion became a statement in ancient Greece. Purple wasn't just a color, it was a symbol, a marker of extreme wealth, an assertion of status that went beyond what words could convey. The dye came from the murex shell, a small sea creature found along the Mediterranean coast. Extracting the dye required thousands of shells to produce even a small amount of usable pigment. The process was laborious, expensive, and the resulting color was incomparably vibrant. A garment dyed in true purple was an object of staggering value. One tunic dyed in genuine purple could cost what an average worker made in a year. For some ultra-luxury pieces, we're talking years of wages. Picture this for a second. A laborer is working, breaking his back in the fields or at the market, earning a few coins a day, and somewhere an aristocrat is wrapping a single piece of cloth dyed purple around his body. That cloth costs more than the laborer will ever see in his entire lifetime. That single garment represents wealth beyond comprehension. So when a noble wore purple, everyone knew it. Everyone understood exactly what statement was being made. I am so wealthy that I can afford to wear money on my body. I am so secure in my status that I can display my resources this overtly. Look at me, is what purple screamed across any room. Look at what I can afford. Look at where I belong. And there's something almost transgressive about that, especially in a society that theoretically valued moderation. Because here's what makes it really interesting. The dye business was often controlled by specific families, specific regions. Wearing purple wasn't just about displaying wealth. It was about displaying access. It was about belonging to a certain circle, participating in certain networks, being part of an elite that could afford these astronomical prices. There were purple traders, purple merchants, people who made their entire fortunes controlling the supply. When some upstart noblemen started wearing purple, it was a challenge to the established order. It was saying, I'm in this club now, whether you like it or not. I have the connections. I have the resources. I'm part of this world. And the reaction from more conservative nobles was often fury. There are accounts of sumptuary laws being proposed or reinforced specifically to restrict who could wear purple, to limit its use to certain occasions, to certain classes of people. These laws would say, only magistrates can wear this, only certain priests, only men of this particular rank. Because even in ancient Greece, the people in power understood that what you wore was a form of power. If everyone could wear purple, it stopped meaning anything. You'd be walking down the street and everyone's in purple, and suddenly it's not special, it's not impressive, it doesn't mean anything anymore. But if you could restrict it, control it, keep it for the truly elite, then wearing it meant something. Then it was a statement. Then it was a claim on status that went beyond just your bank account. It was a claim on belonging to something exclusive, something rarefied, something that marked you as fundamentally different from the masses. And breaking those laws by wearing purple anyway, that was power itself. The nobility that spent their time in the gymnasium existed in this weird space where they were deliberately displaying their bodies in ways that would have shocked absolutely everyone else in Greece. The gymnasium was where young men trained, wrestled, competed in athletic contests. And they did it naked, or close to it. A loincloth at best, but often completely unclothed, oiled up, their bodies on display in a way that was absolutely segregated from normal society. Women were absolutely forbidden. Older men came to watch and train, but the space was defined by its exclusivity and by the deliberate nakedness of the athletes. Think about this for a minute. In a world where you covered your body, where modesty was expected, where showing your skin beyond your face and hands was considered inappropriate, there was this one place where the rules completely inverted. Men walked in, stripped off their clothes, covered themselves in oil, and stood there in front of each other and trainers and spectators. To outsiders, this looked insane. To women, to foreigners, to people not part of this world, it was shocking and bizarre. Why would you deliberately take off all your clothes to exercise? Why would you oil yourself like that? Why would you create these spaces where men stood naked with other men, being looked at, judging each other's bodies? It didn't make sense through a lens of modesty or propriety. The word gymnasium comes from the Greek word gymnos, naked. That was literally what it meant. The place of nakedness. That wasn't a bug in the system, that was the whole point. But within the culture, the gymnasium was something different. It was a statement about masculine power, about the body as a form of art, about the idea that there were spaces where normal social rules didn't apply. The philosophers approved of it. Plato himself spent time in gymnasiums. It was part of the ideal of Greek education, the balance between mind and body, the development of the whole person. But that doesn't change the fact that stepping into a gymnasium as a noble was a deliberate rejection of the clothing norms that governed the rest of Greek life. You were saying, in this space the rules are different. My body is not something that needs to be hidden. In fact, my body is something worth displaying, worth perfecting, worth looking at. My body is important enough that I'm going to put it on display. I'm going to make it beautiful. I'm going to make it strong. And I'm going to let people look at it. And for a culture that had strict rules about modesty and propriety, especially for men who were supposed to maintain a certain dignity and restraint, that was radical. That was a direct challenge to the normal order of things. Some of the more extreme athletes took it further. They were known for keeping their bodies on display, for maintaining a gymnasium physique, even outside of the gymnasium, for adopting certain mannerisms that deliberately marked them as men who had spent time in that space. There's a line in some sources about men who moved like they'd spent so much time stripped down and oiled that they couldn't quite remember how to exist in normal clothes. It's probably exaggerated, but the point stands. Living that way, being that way, was a choice that marked you. It separated you from ordinary men. It said something about your place in society, your confidence, your willingness to be different. It said, I belong to a space where normal rules don't apply. I'm part of an elite that can afford to spend time building their bodies, perfecting their physiques, being looked at and admired. And for a lot of conservative Greeks, it was shocking, even if it was also weirdly admired. There was something compelling about it, even if it violated everything they believed about proper behavior. Then there are the specific nobles who became legendary for their sartorial choices. Men like Alcibiades, who was probably the most famous for deliberately pushing boundaries with his appearance and his behavior. Alcibiades came from an elite Athenian family, was absurdly wealthy, absurdly talented, and absurdly aware of his own power. He wore his hair in unusual ways. He dressed in styles that didn't match Athenian tradition. He adopted foreign fashions, Sicilian styles, things that had no place in respectable Athens. He allegedly dyed his hair. He wore his clothes in ways that scandalized conservative society, and he did it deliberately, knowing it would shock people, knowing it would make him the center of attention. The sources describe him as someone who understood that fashion was a form of power, a way to make sure that when he walked into a room, all eyes went to him. That wasn't accident. It was strategy. It was him understanding that in a society where everyone's supposed to be equal, appearance is one of the few ways you can claim to be above the rules. You can't openly say you're better than everyone else. But you can dress like you are. You can carry yourself like you are. You can make yourself impossible to ignore. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't trying to blend in. It was the opposite. He was walking around saying, "Look at me, I'm different, I'm powerful, and I don't care what you think about my clothes." And people couldn't help but look, couldn't help but notice, couldn't help but talk about him. That's power. There were other nobles who dyed their beards, wore gold jewelry at levels that conservative society found obscene, experimented with hairstyles that were associated with women or with foreign men. They painted their faces. They wore makeup. Not because they were confused about gender or culture, but because they understood that these choices were transgressive, and they were making the transgression deliberately. It wasn't confusion. It was defiance. It was saying, you think these things are inappropriate for men. Good. I'm doing them anyway. I'm doing them because I can. I'm doing them because the normal rules don't apply to me. Some nobles started wearing loose, draped clothing inspired by Persian fashion, flowing fabrics, silhouettes that were completely foreign to Greek tradition. Persia was the enemy for a lot of Greek history, the great rival, the barbarian threat. So wearing Persian styles wasn't just about looking different. It was a political statement. It was either a statement of admiration for Persian culture and a rejection of Greek parochialism, or it was a provocation, wearing the clothes of the enemy to show that they didn't frighten you, that you were cosmopolitan enough, confident enough to borrow from the barbarians. And the reaction from more traditional Greeks was intense. People talked. People complained. Conservative voices rose up saying, "This is corruption. This is foreign influence. This is the destruction of Greek values." These were often the same men who were politically ambitious, who were pushing boundaries in other ways, who were challenging the status quo in multiple arenas. Their fashion choices were part of a larger pattern of deliberate provocation. They were young, they were talented, they were wealthy, and I were making it clear that they didn't feel bound by the same rules as everyone else. The thing that really drove home for me is that for a lot of these nobles, the shocking fashion choices weren't separate from their politics or their philosophy. They were intertwined. The men who wore purple, who dressed in foreign styles, who pushed the boundaries of what was acceptable, were often the same men who were challenging other aspects of Athenian tradition. They were asking questions about democracy, about the role of the elite, about whether the old ways were really the best ways. Their clothes were part of their argument. When you dressed differently, you were making a claim that you weren't bound by tradition. You were suggesting that maybe the rules everyone else followed didn't apply to you. You were, in a very real way, saying that you thought you were above the normal restrictions. And for a society that theoretically valued equality among citizens, that was genuinely threatening. There's a reason sumptuary laws kept coming up. There's a reason conservative voices kept complaining about the way some men dressed. They understood instinctively that what you wore was connected to how you carried power, how you claimed authority, how you positioned yourself in relation to everyone else. If you let nobles dress however they wanted, if you let them wear whatever they could afford, you were essentially saying that wealth and individual preference mattered more than collective values. And in a city-state built on the idea of shared civic values, that was a real problem. The fact that Greek nobles wore foreign fashions connects to something deeper about the anxiety ancient Greece felt about the rest of the world. Every time you see a complaint about a nobleman dressing in Asiatic style or adopting Persian customs, you're seeing cultural anxiety. You're seeing the fear that if your young men started dressing like barbarians, thinking like barbarians, adopting barbarian values, then maybe they'd stop being Greek. Maybe they'd go native. Maybe the whole civilization would be corrupted from the inside out. It was a real concern. Greece defined itself against the barbarians, against the rest of the world. Greek was a category that mattered. It meant something. It signified superiority, civilization, culture. So when some ambitious noble started wearing loose, flowing clothes like a Persian, or adopted the hairstyles of Egyptians, or wore the kind of gold jewelry that screamed wealth in ways that seemed effeminate to Greek sensibilities, the reaction was intense because the stakes felt high. It wasn't just about clothes. It was about whether Greek culture was strong enough to stand against foreign influence, whether Greek men could be trusted to maintain their identity, whether the elite could be trusted to remember that they were Greek first and wealthy second. Conservative voices would rise up saying, if we let our best men dress like Persians, if we let them adopt foreign ways, if we let them blur the lines between Greek and barbarian, then what does it mean to be Greek anymore? What protects our civilization? What makes us superior to the rest of the world? And some of these nobles were probably deliberately playing with that anxiety. They understood exactly what they were doing. They understood that wearing foreign clothes was provocative, that it raised questions about identity and loyalty, that it made them the subject of intense scrutiny and judgment and criticism. And they did it anyway. Maybe because they genuinely preferred the foreign styles, found them more beautiful or more sophisticated. Maybe because they wanted to appear cosmopolitan, well-traveled, sophisticated in ways that went beyond what Athens could offer, that went beyond the traditional Greek ideal. Maybe because they enjoyed the reaction, enjoyed being dangerous, enjoyed marking themselves as men who were above the normal rules, above the normal categories, free to move between worlds. The political implications of all this are actually kind of staggering when you think about it. In a democracy, or a society pretending to be democratic, everyone was supposed to be equal. The wealthy had more power economically, but the idea was that in theory, all citizens had equal say. Everyone's voice mattered the same. Everyone was equal before the law. That was the theory. But when you started wearing clothes that announced your wealth, your status, your connection to exclusive circles, you were making a claim that went against that ideal. You were visually, constantly, asserting that you were different from ordinary men, that you belonged to a different category, that the rules that applied to everyone else didn't apply to you. It was a walking, talking, visible assertion of superiority. And the society reacted by trying to regulate it, by creating laws that said, no, you can't wear that. No, you can't dye your hair like that. No, you can't dress in foreign styles. No, you can't display your wealth quite so openly. No, you can't dress like you're above everyone else because everyone's supposed to be equal. That was the whole point. But those laws kept getting broken, kept needing to be reinforced, because there was a whole class of men who understood something crucial. Breaking those laws was how you claimed power. It was how you proved that you were untouchable, that no rule could bind you, that the regulations that constrained ordinary citizens didn't apply to someone as elevated as you. The fact that you could walk through the agora dressed in prohibited ways and face no real consequences, that was the ultimate power move. That was you demonstrating that you were beyond the law, beyond regulation, above the need to conform. In a weird way, the nobles who dressed to shock weren't just being vain or provocative, though that was part of it. They were making a claim about power and authority. They were saying, look at me. I can do whatever I want, and there's nothing you can do about it. Every time someone complained about their purple dye, or their foreign hairstyle, or their excessive jewelry, that noble won. They'd succeeded in making themselves impossible to ignore. They'd demonstrated that they could transgress without consequence. They'd marked themselves as men who operated by different rules. And in a society where power mattered more than we like to admit, where what you could get away with defined your status as much as what you owned, that was worth dressing for. That was worth taking risks for. That was worth making people uncomfortable for.